So that's kind of the UCSD thing. I don't know. Are there other questions? Jay Shree asked the difference between core and soft funding. So core funding is my permanent staffing funding that is not grant or other extramural funds. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Claire, when you think about that funding, in my experience, there were actually sort of three types of funding. I had recurring, what you were calling core funding, recurring hard money, and then there was soft money, and then there was one-time money. And the funny thing was that, with a good relationship with the CIO, there was often a little bit of money at the end of the year that he did not want to give back.
Right.
And I couldn't count on it, but it ended up making a real difference when I wanted to open up a new compute pool or something like that.
Right.
Is that a factor for you?
Absolutely. When we do some of our pilots and proofs of concept, that's the kind of money that we do. Or if we want to upgrade, say, for example, our Personar environment, that's the kind of money where we will try to justify our request for one-time funds. Sometimes it's so for example, I have this idea at the San Diego Supercomputer Center offers 200 terabyte bricks of data in a Cumulo environment. And that's just way too much for the long tail researchers. They need something over 5 terabytes or 2 terabytes or something, but they don't need to pay for 200 terabytes. I worked it out with SDSC that my systems integrations engineers would be their contact and our research facilitators would be the front face to the ability for us to break out a brick into 8 pieces. So a researcher could get 25 terabytes at 1/8 the cost of the 200 terabyte brick with no overhead additional. Because our team does everything at no cost, we could just divide the 200 terabyte brick by 8, and that was the cost. And then we did the technical and the front face piece so that SCSC does not have to do that. And it's a very popular program because for under $200 or $2,000 a year, they get 25 terabytes, which is pretty inexpensive. Let's see. Sorry, trying to catch up on some of the questions here.
Yeah, Deb was asking about what the semantics of core funding were. So that I think that she's raised another interesting question, though, is the recharge culture. And is your campus one that thinks that recharge is the way to go, or is your campus one that says avoid recharge if you can?
I personally am the latter. I say no recharge if I can help it. One of the biggest feedbacks from our faculty were, I'm tired of all of you people saying the first thing out of your mouth is what's what we called an index number, what's your funding source? How are you going to pay for this? And so that's where my team kind of grew out of. What we're going to do is we're going to capitalize on all of the free things that we possibly can. There's a ton of stuff around campus that people just don't know about. I think we found that with the capabilities model, right? When we talked about if a researcher answered the questions for the capabilities model, they would say, no, things don't exist. They just don't know about them.
Yeah, right.
And so that's where we started. When my program started in 2015, I basically only had salary. I didn't really have a budget at all. And my program started with just me to begin with. So I was able to go from 2015 to now, and now we have 6 + 2 students.
Oh. So I want to make sure we give everybody a chance. Really interesting discussion, and thank you, Claire, for sharing all of that stuff, and for all the questions. This is also helpful, just getting that discussion going. Jim, do you want to jump in?
Sure, yeah, I'm sharing my screen, I think, right now.
Yep.
So people are able to see that, great. Slides hopefully won't get in the way of discussion, but rather provide some context that might be useful. So just for that context, I'm going to be really sort of zooming in on the Minnesota Supercomputing Institute, which is one of the units that I oversee as Director of Research Computing at the University of Minnesota. And so for a little bit more context, because I know people report up very differently. And so I report to the Vice President for Research, but I have very strong collaborations with other providers on campus, some of whom are reporting under the CIO, the Chief Information Officer. So a little bit about what we do. We have an unusually large number of staff, and I say that having come from Florida State University, where I had 10 staff. So just in MSI alone, I have 53 full-time staff. I'll go a little bit into how those people are funded. And across research computing in general, I have about 77 full-time staff and a couple handfuls of students. Number of services that we provide, not unusual for this space. Sort of self-service access to large-scale computing and data resources. We also do a bunch of tutorials. And then we have project staff, and this is kind of what I'm going to get into specifically for what we're calling sort of dedicated projects. We also do a bit, as time permits, of testing what we call sort of bleeding edge environment, sometimes for proposals when we're collaborating with someone in a specific domain area. The big thing that I want to focus on, and we've touched a little bit on it, but I'm going to really sort of tighten up the scope probably a little bit in terms of at least what I'm addressing, is how do we staff our general core services, but then also address some of the demands that we have around more specific domain needs, these sort of dedicated needs. And in particular, you could think of this as maybe as an example, how do we scale our pool of experts to meet new demands? Specifically, I think for us, this is in the data intensive research area. And in some ways, you might be able to see some analogies here with some of the challenges that we faced around computing resources. You know, how do we scale those resources where we have specific demands? And we know that what came out of that was sort of more of a condo model, or some way in which researchers could contribute some of their grant dollars to get the types of resources that they needed to support their research activities. And so, oops, sorry about that. And so we have this very general model. I'm going to talk about sort of that figure on the right for people, where you can imagine, at least on these two dimensions, and I know this is super limited, but I hope it gives the idea where, you know, on one end of the spectrum, you have this idea of full cost recovery. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have this idea of fully subsidized systems, or people, not systems, this is people. And very often sort of on the left-hand side is what your leadership wants. We've alluded to that, and, you know, they would like to see someone else paying for it. And on the sort of right-hand side, our faculty members want it to be fully subsidized and have good arguments for that as well. On the other axis, you can see sort of that a spectrum. Again, this is a very simple model, but, you know, on the top, you might see sort of a broad set of solutions, and on the bottom, you might see custom solutions. And so to a certain extent, I think it's also true that, you know, our faculty would like to see the systems or the people that we have working on these things very finely tailored to their particular needs. But you know, our leadership also wants us to address everyone at the university who might have staffing needs. And so this is kind of the landscape that we're trying to deal with. And for this, we have this notion of sort of consultations where we do actually about 85% of our work is associated with no direct cost. We're just working on relatively short engagements and trying to help people move forward. They may have labs that are specifically suited to deal with the problems, but they do need some support. And then we have this notion of collaborations where we have more dedicated research involvement. This might involve weeks to months of commitments to specific projects. And we're fortunate to have the discretion to work sort of in that space as it serves the larger goals of research computing. And then this third category, we have this notion of partnerships. And this is where actually cost recovery comes in, and where we have well-defined agreements, longer-term commitments for funding areas of research that are generally considered to be sort of core research areas at the University of Minnesota. And when we plot these on the very simple landscape that I described over to the right, we see that, you know, the consulting sort of deals with this issue that is sort of fully subsidized, deals well with the sort of economies of scale. Collaboration falls somewhere in the middle, and then partnership really is important for those cases where there are dedicated requirements. And in those cases, we are actually really requiring, very firmly so, in fact, cost recovery. And in part, again, because this is sort of the way that we see that we can scale to address sort of that spectrum of requirements that very often are required on our campuses. I've been talking a lot. You can learn more about this approach in a paper that we published through PERC last year. And so the citation is listed here. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions about what we're doing and engage in a broader conversation on the topic.
So Jim, I'll ask you the same thing. You know, I think you got at this a little bit in some of your discussion, but when you think about doing strategy, you know, as you're looking out for a couple of years and what you want to do new with the program or changes you want to make and things like that, what are the factors that you think most constrain you or offer opportunities that are particular because of your organization?
Yeah, that's a great question, Patrick. And I remember talking about this with Jackie at the CASC meeting. Is some of the constraints are just some fundamental core set of individuals within your organization, right? If you don't have some some critical mass, it's difficult to be creative in terms of sort of your strategic approach to addressing some of the demands. And so a lot of us spend a lot of time making that case to our administration, is that, you know, if you just gave me more people, we could do more interesting things. You know, we could begin to strategize in terms of how better to address some of the demands that we have on campus. And I think it would be super interesting to sort of know, is there a critical mass that, you know, an institute of higher education needs to achieve in order to actually effectively address some of the range of challenges that we face on campus. Because I would posit that it's really sort of silly to try to implement a cost recovery approach across campus, across all the domains that sometimes our RDC groups attempt to serve, if you only have 5 people, you know, because you're going to end up serving one domain or something like that, or you're going to serve 5 domains poorly. And so, you know, I think just kind of figuring out what that critical mass is, given your campus dynamics, would be an interesting thing to do. And maybe some of the data that is being collected in the table could help us get a better picture of that, or better.
So I actually maybe might push back a little bit on the fact that there's a balance, at least I have found a balance between choosing disciplines that you're going to support versus choosing issues. right? And it's a combination of the two because, you know, like the humanities is very different from a compute intensive group that needs your support. So for me, it's both those big kind of natural things like compute that you support versus there are like issues of the day. So the latest thing for us, I feel like for me, this is going to be the year of data. Because I feel like I am in every other meeting I'm in is about data, data management, regulated data, you know.
Yeah, we're hearing that a lot. And something else I wanted to throw out, because I was thinking about, Jim, what you were saying and a little bit about this idea of supporting domain. In addition, you know, if you're a recharge based, there's another really important factor there, which is how are indirects distributed on campus? Because I've seen institutions where they're recharge based with the expectation that the indirects will subsidize access for researchers. But what that means is that science and engineering has very cheap access to cluster and other services. And the humanities and social sciences, which just don't have that much indirects, they get screwed on the pricing, which means effectively they don't have the same access, even though theoretically it's recharge and equitable for everybody. So there's a lot of different factors that play into, okay, well, how does that model actually play out on campus?
Yeah, maybe I wasn't clear, but you know, it's not binary, right? I mean, it's across the spectrum. So, I mean, we again provide a huge amount of our services free of cost, and we're able through this collaboration mechanism to actually put some focus on areas that are of general sort of relevance. And
right.
So,
and I didn't mean to, sorry if I sounded like I was speaking to your institution in particular. It's just, as I say, I've seen this model where it's theoretically recharged, but it's hugely just, you know, it's really not fair at all across campus because of, at a given campus, they distribute indirects back to departments and schools, whereas like at Berkeley, indirects went to the campus. So anything that was done with that money was done for the whole campus. And I just want to make one real quick comment about Claire's point, and then Deb's got her hand raised. When we were capturing metrics, we would look at sort of compute and data resources consumed by domain and consulting engagements by domain. And there was almost always an inverse relationship there. To Claire's point, you can't, there's no way you can give enough compute, or you're never going to worry about how much compute the humanities are going to consume. It's trivial, but they need a lot of consulting help because they didn't all come up through grad school doing computationally intensive methods. Whereas the people who are going to consume everything, like the climate stuff, they don't need any help. They know how to do this stuff. So anyway, with that comment, Deb.
Yeah, that's kind of what happens at Michigan too. The HPC is all recharge. But then there's like large colleges that also have their own IT groups who do get the indirects for their folks. So I was at the med school. The med school was able to centrally subsidize like 80% of the compute costs, whereas like small little schools are going to have to pay 100%. But that's kind of ties back to a comment I made in chat about this consulting collaborating partnership. Kind of the way we came up with our subsidies was we would subsidize 80% of what's needed. So like 80% of storage costs, 80% of compute, 15% of the collaboration. That's when we start getting into recharge, but not like full recharge, just like a little bit of recharge so they don't take advantage of things. And then like the 5% partnerships, that's where we just have to like treat each individual project on its own. Like we have one guy who's trying to make a brain scanning device that's going to have 20 light sheets going at once.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
That's an epic amount of
so that
data.
one's gonna be, that one's, oh, yeah,
Yeah.
everything needed. And
So
that
Deb-
one's definitely like, the grant is gonna have to cost share a lot of that.
Yeah, right.
So,
All right. Really, really good discussion. And again, I want to make sure Melissa has a chance to talk a little bit about her program there. And then Melissa, if you want, you can also read what Jackie was going to try to contribute since she wasn't able to join us.
I can do that. So, and you mean Jackie's piece from inside the table?
Well, that or the note that she sent us about what she had
you know
planned
what?
to say today since she couldn't make
Okay,
it.
I will try and grab that after. I actually haven't even, I didn't see Jackie's piece. So, yeah, so I'm in a perhaps an enviable but interesting position where I'm 2 months in to a brand new position that existed. It didn't really exist in the form it is now. There was a role, but it was quite different. So the Center for Research Computing at Rice was predominantly driven by HPC users and needs. And it was, the center itself was located within an institute on campus, the Ken Kennedy Institute. So, you know, a very heavily computer science oriented institute with faculty engaged around sort of very big domain entries like energy, health, and now AI and machine learning is sort of another big domain area that they're working on. And again, that area is also then combined with the domain areas. A couple of years ago, there was a reorganization. The center was and is under the CIO still. The center was moved out from Ken Kennedy to exist as a separate unit now, a standalone unit under the CIO. And that all happened right around COVID. So there's been sort of a let's keep driving the ship in the same direction. We are supporting, and I'll give a quick frame on sort of the groups that we have providing service, but the orientation toward supporting individual researchers or projects has been sort of the orientation right along, and the model or the structure of the staffing is the same way. So we have an infrastructure and integration group that does everything from bare metal to middleware to you know, managing new instruments that come in or nodes that get added in. We've got a carryover, a group of people that do Linux administration. At some point, there are research boxes on campus that were run by central IT that now are shifted over to research computing. And so we've got a couple of people out in the field that manage those Linux boxes, which are sitting in research labs. We've got a couple of facilitators, and then we've got an HPC group, both hardware and then also application support. So these, and I've actually organized them in a way, and I'll tell you one more in a second, but I've organized them in a way that actually is, in my view, closer to the 4 to 5 groups we're going to end up with. Right now, if you look at the org chart, it looks like we have 7 different groups of 2 people, 2 or 3 people. And we're working toward a service model and an organization where we'll have 4 groups of people providing services that are more integrated. So bringing the people facing and hardware and software facing people, bringing them all together around particular kind of services. And then we've got a group that actually provides web applications, data analytics, particularly in the spatial and data visualization space. And they serve very large digital humanities projects and social science projects that are very data driven, particularly where data integration has to happen with data from different kinds of sources and heterogeneous kinds of data as well. And that group right now functions separately. So the digital humanities group and the spatial lab group function separately, but we're putting them into a single group. Because from my view, that group is actually going to be much stronger as a whole than their separate parts. So we're in a space where we actually have to do some very significant restructuring of the center itself, and move from a HPC person orientation to the charge now is to move toward a whole campus service organization role. So we're putting a plan in place, a strategy first, and then a plan in place for scaling. The charge was first put to me a few weeks ago, double the size of the center in 3 years. So that's shifted a hair for all manner of reasons. We're sort of going to stretch that out a little bit more than 3 years, just because of the scale of growth and the processes that need to happen, and also because when I put the budget together to do that, it made sense to slow that out to a longer period of time to rebuild, or to keep building. And so that's where we are. And we run, right now, we run about five different resources. One is for specialized, so controlled, unclassified data. So that's both cloud compute and storage. We've got another cloud service, and we have a third resource that we're reorienting to be more campus facing, that will also provide resources for CS and machine learning. Any researchers doing a lot of machine learning work, CS and ECE, which is really interested in this machine. And then we've got a long-term, much bigger resource that we reconstitute every couple of years. So that's what's happening. We've got both on-prem cloud, small scale, but cloud and HPC and high throughput resource. And then we've got a couple campus champions that also are part of the HPC group, and they work with people that want to use access resources. So that's where we are. We're also in a space where I completely agree with Claire on really needing to bring some focus to data and the data lifecycle and the relationship to the services that advanced research computing, our group is going to provide, and partnering with the library. But we're also at Rice, it just happens we have an entirely new administration that started this past summer. And so there are a lot of sort of strategic plans underway, and we need the current research data policy is, I think, about 10 years old. And so we're going to be starting a process to completely revise the data policy. So, and I think once we start to do that, that'll actually help us drive some areas of where we want to add some staff. So the staffing plan, we have only one person doing, for example, research software engineering, and they're embedded. And we know that, we can't scale the embedded model right now in the ways that, we just can't scale that model. So we do need to have some additional research software engineers. We are working on what that model needs to look like, and how to sort of jumpstart that program. There were some people on campus. Those positions went away with the reorg a few years ago, and we've got a call on campus to do that. So that's one area we'll grow in, and I think that those folks will have some more domain orientation. So I'm sort of, you're catching me. I'm really in the midst of really designing a strategy and really starting to put a 5-year plan in place for what the center as an organization is going to look like.
Yeah. So you're in some ways in the thick of this discussion, and are there as you're putting this together and as you're settling in there, what are some of the things that you're recognizing are going to constrain your options there or going to present key opportunities there?
Right. So let me first give a really big hat tip to Jim and his colleagues' paper from PERC last summer that Jim shared out a while ago. That paper actually really helped me start to think about and ask questions about the kind of model that might work here. The partnership model is incredibly intriguing to me. The constraint is that well, the general constraint here is the context and the sort of ongoing way that the culture is here is that, you know, we've been doing it this way for a long time, so that's how we do it, you know. And so I'm, you know, part of the constraint here is to begin to pitch some models that resonate with the people who will be sort of champions and advocates on campus, to begin to have conversations about the kinds of models that we think might work here, and then how best to do that and build relationships in some new ways. You know, we have very good relationships with a handful of departments. We have very good relationships, you know, with individual faculty, but moving toward a whole of campus approach, and having to rethink even how we charge for HPC. And right now, the HPC resources are the only ones we charge for. We don't actually charge for any of the others. We know we have some costing, but we don't charge for anything else. And so we have that same issue of we have new faculty that come on board and they're like, well, why do I have to pay this membership fee if I'm not even using cycles for 6 months? And I mean, it's, you know, there's sort of these kinds of questions. And the same thing with unbalanced cost to units, because they don't have overhead that they can use to support the fees
Right.
for the HPC. So, you know, it's that whole, the opportunities are, we have a new VPR and we're going to be adding, you know, several hundred new faculty over the next few years. And we have areas of research that are going to grow. And so the opportunities are, we can really start to partner in some new ways, and show that those new kinds of ways are going to be good and fruitful. And then the constraints are really getting toward models that'll be rational and acceptable and a bit more, you know, potentially fair and equitable across campus. And how do we do that? So, yeah.
So thanks. I'm sorry to cut you off, Melissa. This is a super interesting discussion. We could definitely go on longer, but we're at the top of the hour. So I think what the steering committee for this was thinking is that this was probably going to take a couple of sessions to explore. And so I think what we'll do is we'll carry on this discussion next time and explore more, you know, thinking about, well, what are these factors and how do they influence us, you know? And there's been a bunch of really good questions and discussion in the chat as well. We'll pull this together and we'll think about, you know, how do we structure the agenda next time to get at some of these key topics. So I'd love to give people a chance for closing comments, but we're almost out of time. If you want to put some suggestions for the discussion going forward into the notes, please feel free to. Claire has said she'll share her slides and we'll get those from Jim as well. I put in Jackie's comments for your review, and we'll carry on the discussion next time. So thank you very much, Claire and Melissa and Jim, for being willing to talk about your programs, and for everybody else for all of your engagement in the discussion. This has been a really cool discussion, and I feel like there's so much more we can explore with this stuff. So hopefully we'll see you all next month.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.